Introduction. Robert Johnson is often lauded as a foundational figure in the history of American blues, with his music considered emblematic of the Delta blues tradition of the 1930s. His mythic status, particularly the infamous Deal with the Devil legend, has cemented him as one of the most iconic figures in American music. However, his influence during the 1930s was modest, and his true cultural impact was felt decades later, during the 1960s folk and rock revivals. This article will explore why Johnson's introduction into American music history is better situated in the 1960s, where his recordings resonated with a new generation of listeners, rather than the 1930s, where other Delta blues artists were more prominent. Part 1. The real Delta blues pioneers of the 1920s and 1930s. While Robert Johnson's name often dominates discussions of early Delta blues, other musicians were more influential in shaping the genre during the 1920s and 1930s. Freddie Spruill, for instance, is credited as the first Delta blues artist to be recorded, with his Milk Cow Blues predating any of Johnson's work. Similarly, Tommy Johnson, Ishmael Bracey, Robert Wilkins, Charlie Patton's Son House, and Big Joe Williams were crucial in laying the foundation of the Delta blues, recording significant works throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s. Notably, Son House, with whom Johnson had a personal connection, was one of the key musicians in the Delta region. His music and style had a direct influence on Johnson. In fact, Johnson's folk blues style can be viewed as a continuation of the work of House and others, rather than as something entirely new. While Johnson did bring a unique flair, especially with his use of the boogie bass, he was not the genre's inventor, but a notable student of it. Part 2. Robert Johnson in the 1930s, a modest legacy. Johnson's recording career in the late 1930s was relatively short, spanning just a few years. During his lifetime, he had only one moderate hit, Terraplane Blues. His music, while respected within the Southern Delta region, did not achieve widespread fame outside of local venues. He recorded a total of 29 songs, which, while celebrated posthumously, did not make significant waves during his era. In comparison, musicians like Charlie Patton's Son House and Blind Lemon Jefferson were recognized as the true innovators of the Delta blues style in the 1920s and early 1930s. These artists helped shape what the world would come to know as Delta blues, and it is they who should be credited for establishing the genre in its formative years. Johnson, on the other hand, remained largely obscure until the 1960s, despite his later recognition as a major influence on future blues and rock musicians. Part 3. The boogie bass and Johnson's unique contributions. While Robert Johnson's music was not revolutionary for his time, it did contain certain stylistic elements that would become influential decades later. The boogie bass, a rhythmic style Johnson employed, laid the groundwork for what would become Chicago blues and rock and roll. This style, which can be heard in Ramblin' on My Mind and I Believe I'll Dust My Broom, was later picked up by musicians like Muddy Waters and Elmore James. In this way, Johnson's influence on blues music is undeniable, but it is a retrospective influence, felt much more strongly in the 1960s than in his own time. Part 4. The myth of the crossroads and its later romanticization. One of the enduring myths surrounding Robert Johnson is the story of his supposed deal with the devil, said to have occurred at a crossroads. This Faustian legend, which parallels the story of the fictional German artist Johann Georg Faust, has often overshadowed the real contributions of Johnson as a musician. However, Friends of Johnson have given conflicting accounts of whether the singer himself ever endorsed this tale. The songs most often associated with this legend, Crossroad Blues and Hellhound on My Trail, make no direct reference to any supernatural encounter. The Crossroads myth only added to the allure of Johnson's music during the 1960s folk and rock revival. Musicians and fans, intrigued by the idea of a deal with the devil, found the story irresistible, further elevating Johnson's posthumous fame. In truth, Johnson's real mentor may have been the guitarist Ike Zinnemann, who reportedly taught him how to play guitar in a graveyard at night. An eerie but more plausible explanation for his skill. Part 5. The 1960s Folk Revival, rediscovering Robert Johnson. It wasn't until the 1960s that Robert Johnson's music truly reached a wider audience, thanks largely to the efforts of Columbia Records and individuals like John Hammond. Columbia's release of King of the Delta Blues Singers in 1961 introduced Johnson's music to a new generation of folk, blues, and rock enthusiasts. Artists such as Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, and numerous English bands became enamored with Johnson's recordings, citing him as a major influence. This wave of interest in the 1960s was a pivotal moment for Johnson's legacy. Musicians like Clapton recorded covers of Johnson's songs, and his work became foundational to the British blues rock scene. It is in this period, not the 1930s, that Johnson's true influence on music can be felt. Part 6. The place of Robert Johnson in music history. Given that Robert Johnson's recordings did not achieve significant recognition until the 1960s, it is more appropriate to place his legacy within this later context. While he played a part in the development of Delta blues, he was not one of its original innovators. Rather, his contributions took on greater significance only when rediscovered by a new generation of musicians and fans, whose fascination with his music and mythic persona transformed Johnson into a cultural icon. Johnson's rightful place in the history of American music is as a bridge between the folk blues of the early 20th century and the electric blues and rock and roll of the 1960s. His legacy is tied to the latter period, where his recordings had the most profound impact on the evolution of modern music. Conclusion: a 1960s icon, not a 1930s innovator. Robert Johnson's legend, while deeply rooted in the traditions of Delta blues, is more a product of the 1960s cultural revival than the 1930s blues scene. His influence on rock and roll, blues, and popular music is undeniable, but it was not realized until decades after his death. In recognizing the full scope of his impact, it is essential to place Johnson within the context of the 1960s, where his music was truly discovered, appreciated, and canonized. By reframing Johnson's legacy in this way, we can better understand his role in American music history, not as an original pioneer, but as a 1960s posthumous icon who bridged the gap between traditional blues and modern rock.